And then this. Tonight we are taking a big bite of Ezekiel. This is probably the biggest chunk that we're going to do, but you will see that it's basically replicating certain patterns over and over with something unique in the middle of this segment. So 24 to 32, 9 whole chapters, and they're mostly judgment chapters with a little bit of something else in between. Okay, the first thing we encounter in the first half of chapter 24 is a parable that is simply called the cooking pot. Now, this was not a parable like Jesus' parables. It's not being told. It is an enacted parable. He was asked to take a pot, put over fire, boil water, and then put some meat in it and keep cooking and keep boiling until it's all broken to pieces and basically useless by the end of the day. Just keep boiling it. When it dries up, add some more water, add some more meat, break it all down over and over. To do this in public, Ezekiel's actions were all done in public. He has been labeled as the most eccentric prophet, but he was not eccentric. God asked him to do some crazy stuff. And this is one of them. Can you imagine? Nobody's eating this meat. Nobody was offered to eat. It's just there boiling and boiling, and he keeps stoking the fire and boiling the meat. All the prophecies in this segment are dated prophecies, very precise dating. This one is 15th of January, 588 BC, or in Hebrew dating, 10th day, 10th month, 9th year of Jehoiachin's capture. Jehoiachin is the second last king of Judah who was taken captive the same year with Ezekiel, and he remained in Babylon the rest of his reign. And the Babylonians put his uncle Zedekiah as king in Judah, and then eventually overthrew him and burned the city of Jerusalem. So from here on in this segment, you have this dating, very chronological dating for every event. So there's this pot on fire, there's water, there's meat. You have to cook it and cook it and cook it so thoroughly that the meat is all broken up. It becomes like a kind of meat soup, but really not for eating, it's just to keep boiling it. And then he was told to explain to the people that this meat being cooked over this fire over and over until it's all broken up, it's nothing there to really eat anymore. This represents God's vengeance. They must observe and see what's happening to this meat. That's what will happen to Judah. Remember, this is a year before, almost 2 years before Nebuchadnezzar captured the city of Jerusalem. And then he was told that he must keep cooking until everything is gone. Have you ever boiled something and then moved away, didn't pay attention, or the water dried up and maybe a hole appeared at the bottom of the pot? That is what happened here. We don't hear about a hole, but everything burnt up or got cooked up or evaporated. Nothing. It was absolutely useless cooking. This is not like my kitchen lessons, which I put on Facebook. But the point is that not only will Judah experience God's vengeance, they're going to experience a double dose of that vengeance. The language is harsh. The imagery is even harsher. You can imagine the exiles who were watching this event and being told what it meant. The capture of Jerusalem hadn't yet happened, so the primary captivity had not taken place yet. About 2 more years before that would happen. So they were being prepared mentally for what they would see as those hundreds of thousands of their countrymen would be marched over 6 months through the desert into Babylon. They were there. They watched them beaten up by the sun, beaten up by their captors, hungry and thirsty, clothes probably in tatter after 6 months on the road in wild desert. And the Babylonians usually would rope up all the people, kind of like cattle, so they don't stray from each other. And they would watch and see this is not happening because some terrorist invaded or because Babylon is such a cruel nation, but because God is punishing. That would be a very hard lesson from this parable But there are several parables of Jesus that end up in the same way, how it would be better for the people or it would be worse for them. They would be thrown into a place where they would gnash their teeth and stay in the cold and so on and so forth. So several parables of Jesus follow a similar pattern, ending with this difficult, dark picture of potential negative consequences to evil. You see, God cannot tolerate sin, but he has an even lower tolerance level when it comes to sin among his own people. And this is something for us to consider. The second part of the chapter 24, is personal experience. This is where he relates to us the death of his wife. But not just that she died, but what God said to him about her death. God told him, and this is before she actually died, "Son of man, with one blow I will take away your dearest treasure. But you must not show any sorrow at her death. You cannot weep. There will be no tears. You may groan silently, but no wailing at her grave." The quintessential Jewish way of celebrating a funeral, and so on. "Do not uncover your head or take off your sandals." In other words, act normal. Do not perform the usual rituals or mourning or accept any food brought to you by consoling friends. Now, the instructions here are similar to those given to Aaron when his sons were killed. And it became a rule: priests cannot participate in the funeral of their families. They cannot weep, they cannot mourn, they cannot show signs of mourning, they cannot partake of the meal, they cannot attend the funeral service, they cannot be present at the grave. It was a very difficult life being a priest in ancient Israel. Now remember, Ezekiel came from a priestly family, so he would have known these instructions. They would not have been new to him, but the context would be new, because God says that the people or the exiles who were in Babylon, when they see this happening, Jeremiah, who was also a priest before he became a prophet or from a priest family, was given similar instructions. The exiles were told that this is how you must react as reports and captives start flooding into Babylon from Jerusalem, and you hear these death stories, the horrible ways in which people who were half starved had resorted to cannibalism in the city of Jerusalem, how people died of hunger and thirst and were burned alive by the Babylonians if they resisted too much. And then others were marched to Babylon over 6 months' journey through the desert, and others ran away to Egypt. Not everybody left. A lot of people remained in the land. Tens of thousands still remain in the land. In light of the current events in the world, from the time that Abraham touched that land and God told him, "This is your land," there has always been descendants of Abraham in that land, unbroken for the last few thousand years. The idea that the diaspora of the Romans or the Babylonian captivity meant that there were periods when there were no Jews in the land of Israel is unhistorical. There has always been people, Jewish people in that land all through history, even during the years of the Ottoman Turks, the Mamluk Turks, the Iraq, Baghdad Caliphate, all those great Muslim empires. There have always been Jews in that land. There have always been descendants of Israel, descendants of Abraham. But these exiles, unlike what we have seen on television of people mourning the death of their loved ones because of the horrible massacre and so on, they were not allowed to do that any more than Ezekiel was allowed to mourn the death of his wife. Now, this is very, very hard medicine on the part of God. You will feel the pain, but you cannot express the pain. You will feel the loss, but you cannot express that loss. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt the most loss in your life and yet you could not express it? I did once in my life, 1996. A co-teacher, co-pastor that I worked with in Singapore, my best friend ever in life, he and I were the two teachers at a Bible camp on Tioman Island, 100 kids in that camp. He went swimming, he drowned. His bodies were recovered 4 days later and brought back to Singapore. His wife was very close. The two families were very close. She insisted that I'm the only one who can conduct his funeral. I've just lost my best friend ever in life. I've never been as close to another human being as to that man or to any of my brothers. And about 1,000 people attended. He was a popular teacher at the college and he had been a very popular pastor. And everybody was crying their hearts out. Some of the students even got angry with me because, now you are taking his place. I had to take over his classes and so on. And I had to conduct that funeral, the worst funeral in my life, one that I'll never forget, March 1996. And I could not show any kind of feeling, any kind of emotion myself. I had to go through the motions of the ritual. I remember a couple of weeks after all this drama was over, funeral was done, and trying to settle the family, stepping into his job on top of my own jobs. This psychiatrist in my church, government employed psychiatrist, he walked to me one Sabbath and he said, Pastor Fanwar, please make sure you take time for your own grief. Now, Ezekiel's command here by God and the command to the people in Babylon, the exiles in Babylon, resonates a great deal with me. Being or experiencing such tremendous loss and not being able to express any sense of grief. And in his case, and the captive's case, not being allowed to express any sense of grief. Ask yourself the question, what would you really do if you were in this situation? There are lots of people who would like to be prophets, not the Ezekiel version of prophet. The next couple of chapters looks at the neighbors of chapter 25, looks at the neighbors, short judgment messages against the neighbors. The first one was against Ammon. Here's Ammon in the yellow. Let me change the pointer. I think it's easier with this one. So here's Ammon to the east in what is the country of Jordan today. The second target was Moab. This was the country that tried to prevent Israel during the time of Moses and Joshua, that final entry from entering the land. And they used Balaam, the prophet from Babylon, by the way, to try and curse them. Then there was Edom. Edom is the people descending from Esau. So they were direct brothers with Israel and Judah, but also great enemies. They remained enemies all their lives with these kingdoms. And then Philistia. This is so much in the news today. By the way, the Gaza Strip today is about half the size of the Philistine territory. Okay, it's only from about here this way. So Philistia was much more. And here's the thing about the Philistines, they were not Asians, they were Europeans, part of a 10th, 11th century invasion of Eastern Mediterranean by hordes of people, probably from the Minoan civilization, Greek civilization, or some people have suggested even the Vikings, who were called the Sea Peoples. Some of them ended up settling over here. They would become Israel's number one enemy. And even David couldn't completely get rid of them. And they were still existing at the time of Ezekiel. Eventually they would disappear from history. The word Palestine was invented by the Romans to get back at the Jews after the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132, 136 AD. And this was their way of being pejorative. Okay, you Jews want this land, we're going to change its name from Judea to Palestinus, which was built on the word Philistines. Philistines, the longest term enemies of Israel for centuries and centuries, from the period of Judges even until the time of the captivity. They were still there. Now, this chapter outlines two reasons for the judgments against these nations. Okay, four of them are targeted here. Notice that the four of them surround Judah completely. By this stage, Israel was basically gone, and everybody was fighting over this territory. The kingdom of Aram from up here, the Aramean tribes from up here, the Assyrians and the Babylonians coming down, the Phoenicians or Lebanese as we know them today. The two reasons are these. These nations, when Nebuchadnezzar invaded Jerusalem, destroyed the city, burned down the temple, and deported the people, they celebrated, they rejoiced. I was listening to this audio recording of one of the Hamas fighters on October 7th. He was recorded on his phone, calling back to his parents in Gaza, telling, Mom, Dad, I have killed 10 Jews with my own hands. And they are shouting, Allahu Akbar, and wow, celebrating on the telephone on the other side. Awesome. Awful. Horrible. Horrific. But that's what happened in the past. History simply repeats itself. Solomon says that. Even worse, some of these, like Kingdom, Moab, and Ammon, not so much the Philistines in this particular case, they actually participated in attacking Judah. Those who were running away from Jerusalem towards Egypt, they were attacked by the Edomites, and the Ammonites and Moabites were attacking the stragglers that the Babylonians were deporting. So they rejoiced over the captivity of Jerusalem and Judah. They participated in attacking. History has a funny way of coming back on itself. All right, then we have this lengthy treatment about Tyre. First, we begin with the actual Tyre, the city state as it was known. Tyre was one of the safest fortresses in the ancient world until Nebuchadnezzar's time, because it was an island. It's about a kilometer away from the coastal line of Lebanon. And the Phoenicians were so sure about being an impregnable city that they basically mocked every power that came through. And they were conquered twice by Nebuchadnezzar, who took 13 years siege to conquer Tyre, and by Alexander the Great, who broke into the city by building a causeway, the first known sea causeway in history to get into the city. This is also dated. So about a month later, the prophecy came, and that it would be destroyed by Babylon, and it was described in great detail. And the reason is the same, that Tyre rejoiced over the fall of Babylon, fall of Jerusalem. Now, here's the funny thing about Tyre. Hiram, the king of Tyre, assisted Solomon in building the temple in Jerusalem. He provided a lot of the gold and most of the woodwork needed for the temple. He was one of the financiers, if you like, backing Solomon's temple project. So during the time of Solomon, the relationship between Tyre and Israel was really, really good. But by the time of the captivity, it had gone very, very sour. And so like the Edomites and the Moabites, they also like, good for them. Okay. Finally, they get their just deserts. So they would be destroyed too. Unlike the other kingdoms, God said something here that took centuries to fulfill. He says that I will wipe Tyre out of history. I will make Tyre an uninhabited ruin, and you will exist no more. You will be looked for, but you will never again be found. Most of ancient Tyre is basically underwater today. After Alexander, the city of Tyre really shrunk in importance. It was one of the great maritime traders. Think of it like the Hong Kong during the British period or the Singapore of today. And then it would slowly disappear. There is still a modern city called Tyre, but not in the site of the ancient one. So the prophecy about the destruction of Tyre did not happen right away. It certainly did not happen only with Nebuchadnezzar. It took another kingdom later, Alexander, before any permanent damage would be done. But unlike those other nations in chapter 25, there is a long dirge about the fall of Tyre. And you will find a similar dirge using similar motifs and concepts in the book of Revelation about the fall of another city called Babylon. Revelation 17:18, this is one of the last, it is the last judgment prophecy in Revelation before the appearance of Christ and the rider on the white horse. And so when you read Revelation 17:18 about the prophecy and the dirge about that Jerusalem, you need to read this prophecy and dirge in about Tyre in Ezekiel. The similarities, the echoes between the two is quite amazing. And yet most Adventists study Revelation 17 and 18 in vacuum, as if there's no other place in the Bible that has a similar kind of material or similar experience or similar motifs. And that brings us to a very unlikely passage that jumps at us out of the blue, and that is chapter 28. In chapter 28, we go from hearing about the city of Tyre to hearing about the king of Tyre. And at first, we, at least in the first 10 verses or so, we can see the literal image. We don't know which king of Tyre this was. His name is not given, but you can go back into Google if you want. The king of Tyre at the time of the Judah's captivity, you can find his name there. It's some difficult name in today's world. He's not really remembered in history except by historians. He's the one who would experience the Babylonian siege, 13 years siege by the Babylonians. And a different reason is given for the king from that of the city. And so Ezekiel is told there's a reason why he will be judged because of his pride. This king of Tyre, like almost every ancient king in the Middle East, he said, I am a god. I sit on a divine throne in the heart of the sea. Now, this is the quotation of God, of his words to Ezekiel. Okay, so he's being destroyed because of his pride, and his pride is a pride of divinity, as if he is God. He desired to elevate himself to God. And then, out of nowhere, it's like we are transported from this human king to another cosmic king. Because what happens in verses 11 to 19 doesn't fit the king of Tyre, the literal king of Tyre. And most Christians have recognized that this second half of chapter 28 parallels Isaiah 14, parallels Revelation 12, and therefore it's talking about a different kind of king, spiritual, cosmic, but also a dirge about him. And the reasons of his judgment, the reason for using the physical king of Tyre as a lens to understand this king is the same. His heart was filled with pride. And before continuing some more descriptions about him, we have a little description about Sidon. That was the twin city of Tyre, Tyre and Sidon. It's often the way it's described in the Bible. And a short passage on Israel's restoration. Okay, so who is this cosmic king? What information is given about him? And what can we deduce from the information given? The first thing we are told here is that, and this clearly is not the physical king of Tyre, that he was a created being but not just any created being. He was a model of creation. Now, for those of you who are interested, in the 3 chapters dealing with the origin of sin, Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28, and Revelation 12, this being who launches a coup d'etat against God, or an attempted coup d'etat against God, is never called an angel. Something to think about, and we'll see why as we go along. It is said, or it was said in the passage, that he was present in Eden, that he was a participant of the creation of humanity. Wow, that's a very special place. And then we have the naming of 12 stones that appear in Exodus and the breastplate of the high priest, and in Revelation and the foundation stones of the New Jerusalem. Exact same stones. We'll look at them. I'll show you a table. The Hebrew names are different, but when you compare the Septuagint and the Greek versions, you see that most of the names are the same. It's 1 or 2 differences with regards to names. And the most important description, which has been mistranslated by practically every English version, is this. And that's because the Hebrew is a little complicated here. It says that he was, remember, he was present in Eden, that he was with the guardian cherub. Now, most English Bibles actually reads this wrongly. It says that he was a guardian cherub. Cherub, for those of you who are familiar with the Hebrew is cherub. And so he had this high position. The guardian cherub would be one of those 4 living beings that we see in Ezekiel 1, around the throne of God, also Isaiah 14 and Revelation 4. Okay, he was not one of them, but he was with one of them. He had a position independent of those 4. He was not this high-ranking security guard. He was something else. The fact that he was present. Now, who this guardian cherub is, it could be the same angel who was appointed to guard the tree of life. After Adam and Eve had eaten from the tree, they could not come back into the garden. When we get to Daniel, we discover that it's probably Gabriel. More importantly, that it might be a reference to Christ himself, Michael. In Christian theology, Michael is believed to be one of the guardian cherubs, but when you read Revelation, Jude, and Daniel, it appears that Michael is more than just an angel, so probably a name for Christ. The cause of his downfall is pride, the same as in Isaiah 14. The results, the same as Isaiah 14 and Revelation 12, that he and those who followed him were expelled from heaven. Ezekiel and Isaiah doesn't tell us who followed him. Revelation does, that the angels of heaven, a substantial number of them, followed him. By the way, the idea of a third doesn't mean that exactly 33%. It simply means that a substantial number of angels followed this being. Now, here's my take. If he's never actually referred to as an angel, but he had this high rank and position, even at the creation itself, that he was a being so powerful, so amazing, that even angels wanted to follow him. And therefore, it made the contest much more equal than we imagine. If he was just an angel, contestation against God, that would not be an equal fight, because we know how angels are described everywhere else. And why would other angels follow another angel? And so this is pure conjecture on my part, but it's based on a lot of searching of the Hebrew Bible. In Hebrew, you cannot find in English, that there is something special about this being. He was described as being perfect in creation. That language is never used of angels anywhere else. It would be unique. Something happened. He got proud about his perfection, about his position, about the fact that he was right up here, right next to God, or maybe wanting to be like God. In Isaiah, he says this to himself, I will be like the Most High. In Revelation, he attempts to take the throne of God by war. Nothing subtle about his approach. And so we are compelled by parallels with Isaiah 14 and Revelation 12 to say that this is most likely a reference to Satan. By the way, please don't say this is a reference to Lucifer. Lucifer is not a proper name. Lucifer is the Latin translation of the Hebrew name. Isaiah gives us the Hebrew name of this being. He calls him Hallel ben Shachar, the bright one, the son of the dawn. And that name is only used one more time in the Bible, and that is in Revelation, and it's applied to Jesus. So clearly, the contest here is between a powerful cosmic being who may be more than just an angel in heaven, with Christ, who is the creator of the angels. What's important about the fall of this being is that he was a created being and aspired beyond being a creation. I was listening on YouTube just this evening when I came back from doing my driver's license. I was a little tired, so I just turned on the YouTube here on my computer and listened as I was preparing or waiting for this meeting. A debate between a Christian scholar with some atheists in some forum in some university in America. And the debate I was watching tonight is all about, how do you know God is there? How do you know God really exists? Most atheists do not actually say there is no God. It's more of an agnostic position. You cannot know. Even if there is one, it's not possible. And they were using some very high philosophical language in the debate. It was quite interesting to listen. But the atheist guy who was pushing the debate said, how can you know? You need a model to know that there is a God, because everything else in human knowing, there is a model by which we know things, and so on and so forth. And of course, the Christian scholar was trying to say, God is the creator. He's above that model. See, the atheist wants to bring God down into the model. Now, the Christian scholar used this argument from science, which says that current scientific theory says that time, space, and matter all had a point of origin. And so from the Bible point of view, we say that that point of origin is God. And therefore, God is outside of time, outside of matter, outside of space. So God is timeless because he's outside. God is spaceless because he's outside. God is matterless because he's outside. This being wanted to be creator. He must have looked there in the Garden of Eden and watching God molding Adam from the earth and constructing Eve from Adam's side and said, I can do that too. I can be like the Most High. This is the root of sin, pride. Any version of pride is the number one sin. It has been listed by Christian theology as the number one sin for the last 2,000 years. Now, in some Christian churches, they think sexual indiscretion is the number one sin. I was in a pastor's meeting, Adventist pastor's meeting, and there were some other church leaders, and they were discussing some of the problems in the church. And one pastor, he blurted out, he said, we don't need to worry about all these other problems. The Adventist church cares only about sex. Everybody went, what? And he said, think about it. We get excited and we expel and we disfellowship. We do all kinds of things. Any form of sexual indiscretion. A man can embezzle $1 million and nothing really bad happens to him. But a church member or a pastor who gets caught with his pants down, well, the whole world is thrown at him. The whole committee group was quite a big group sitting in this conference room. We were so, on the one hand, laughing at the way he put it, but also came to the realization, remember how Jesus dealt with sexual sin? The Pharisees, who were full of religious pride, got this woman How do you catch a woman committing adultery, by the way? Okay, anyway, you go home and dream about that. Brought her to Jesus. Should we stone her? The law says we should stone her. You remember how Jesus dealt with it? He picks up a stone, probably in his hand, tosses it around, and he says, okay, I have a stone. Any of you who thinks you have no sin, implying that you don't even have pride, here, take the stone and throw. And they all just quietly disperse from the crowd. Uh, it's an amazing fact. There's only one thing that really can disconnect people from God, and that is pride. Think of it like a person who has fancy mobile phone, i15 or whatever, the latest one, but doesn't have the charger on the cable. It will just die. Nothing you can do about it. No matter how much the phone costs, no matter how wonderful the phone is, no matter how much you can say to yourself, I have the best mobile in the world. No charger, you're dead duck. That's it. And this being, for all of his gifts, for all of his perfection, pride came in, it's like charger disappeared. Now he can no longer live. Let me just briefly show you about the 12 stones. It's very unusual that there are only 3 places where these 12 stones appear. At the breastplate of Aaron, in this Eden creation that this being walked among the 12 stones, and then at the foundations of the New Jerusalem. And here they are. These are the Hebrew names. With the Aaron stones, the Hebrew Bible does not list 3 of them. We don't know why. Maybe there's something missing in the manuscripts. But these are the Greek names. These are the names in Ezekiel, in the Septuagint, which is Greek. These are the names in Exodus for the high priest breastplate. And these are the names in Revelation. All 3 listing are in Greek. Okay. You can see that the majority of them are exactly the same. And scholars think that even those that look a bit displaced are probably referring to the same by a different name, or they just simply got the order a little different. So maybe this one should go here, and Sapphira should come here, and then you have the listing complete. Or this one comes down here, and all this listing becomes complete. And so you can, if you shuffle the names properly, you'll get the exact same 12 names. Now here's a question. Why does it mention these 12 stones in relationship to this being? It's only in relationship to the high priest of Israel and the New Jerusalem of God. And yet, this being shared that lofty status, as high as Aaron and as holy as the New Jerusalem. And yet, he was the one who brought sin into the world. And here's the mystery of sin, as Paul calls it, that it could actually begin with somebody like this. And that brings me to my theory of how temptations work. You see, this being fell because temptation ate at his strength. He had no weaknesses. Okay, but when he began to think about his strength and wanting more than those special gifts God had given him, sin starts to germinate. And so when we talk about temptations, look at the 3 temptations of Christ. They are model. None of them had anything to do with a weakness that Jesus had. They all had to do with a power, a strength that Jesus had. You know, the devil couldn't care 2 hoots about your weaknesses, your human weaknesses. You already inherit those with sin. Real temptation is when he targets your strength. When he gets a pastor to believe that he's the best sermon on earth, the best preacher on earth. When he gets a Christian singer to believe that she is the best musician in the church. When he gets a church leader to believe he is the highest human being next to God himself. Anytime that humans are really tested by the devil, it's when the devil targets their strength. Many Christians believe that the devil targets our weaknesses. Why? He doesn't need to do anything. If I have a weakness with physical health, he doesn't need to do anything. I'm going to be sick all the time anyway. But if I have perfect health, then he's going to target that, or close to perfect health. If I don't have a very good IQ, I have to study very hard to get good grades. He doesn't really care about that. But if I have this great mind and I can pick things up and I can remember things with photogenic memory, he is photographic memory. That's what he's going to target. And so when you look at all the great philosophers who walked away from the Judeo-Christian tradition, from the Bible, to develop other theories, they were all brilliant men, without a doubt, super hyper IQs. Whether you think of Nietzsche, the German philosopher who ended up saying God is dead, or Karl Marx, who's saying there is no God. Oppenheimer ends up building an atom bomb, and so on and so forth. The list goes on and on. And the way sin began in heaven tells us exactly how sin functions even today. So the prouder a person gets, the higher the person thinks he or she is, the harder the devil works on them. He doesn't care about your perceived or real weaknesses. He's got you there already. All right, so those are the stones. They are part of this picture of perfection. The next two chapters targets Egypt. And this is kind of strange because Egypt did not have a hate relationship with Judah at the time of the captivity. There were love-hate relationship off and on. But Egypt was also seen as the primary southern superpower and played an important role in the prophecies of Daniel and so on. Egypt even appears in Revelation. So we need to touch on it. Again, this prophecy is dated. This is getting closer to the actual Babylonian captivity, probably the same year or a few months before. And Egypt was said to be conquered they will be conquered by Nebuchadnezzar. Well, when this prophecy was made, it was actually like a postpaid prophecy. A prepaid prophecy, because it had already happened. No, sorry, postpaid, correct. So it's already been used. Now you're paying for it. The time when Babylon went from being a kingdom in Sumeria to being the number one superpower was when it defeated Pharaoh Necho at the Battle of Carchemish, which is somewhere in the Lebanon, Syria region, the year 605. That's when the very first captivity began, or the first attempt at captivity, when some Jews were taken from Jerusalem. Okay. Egypt were so soundly beaten that they never became a superpower again after 605 BC. And they were feeling so horrible about losing to Nebuchadnezzar that on their way back to Egypt, they kind of made as much trouble for various towns and cities of the kingdom of Judah as they could. And maybe that's why the prophecy exists. It is said that Egypt will be desolate for 40 years. This is hard to pinpoint to any particular moment in history, especially this period of history. But that is the prophecy. But eventually they will be restored, but only as a minor kingdom. The name Egypt has stayed in human history. Alexander raised a city called Alexandria and raised the profile of Egypt. One of his generals, Ptolemy, raised the Ptolemy period of Egypt, a pretty high profile period of Egypt. The Mamelukes, the power of the Mameluk Muslim kingdom came out of Egypt. And the most famous Muslim ruler against the Crusades, particularly his wars with Baldwin the Fourth and King Richard the Lionheart was Saladin, came from Egypt. So there were those moments in history that they would be, but they never became the superpower they were. You see, there was a point in history up to the Exodus when Egypt was the hyperpower of the world, kind of like America is today. And then competitors appeared in the north, first Assyria and then the Hittites, and these three would be going at each other. So it became China, Russia, and America kind of thing. And then Assyria was overthrown and Babylon took over their place. Babylon basically destroyed the Hittites, and Babylon defeated the Egyptians. Okay. And so by the time of Ezekiel, Egypt still existed there, but they were really nothing more, just a shell of a kingdom. And that's why many Jews felt safe to run away to Egypt who were not taken captives and built their own community there. And like with Tyre, we have a long dirge for Egypt as well. And you can read that dirge. They all run the same way. Talks about the grief and the suffering and why this happened, and the lamentation. In chapter 31, Egypt and Assyria are put together. And here's the interesting thing, because when Nebuchadnezzar defeated Egypt at the Battle of Carchemish, he had already defeated and overthrown the Assyrian Empire. So these were the two superpowers prior to Babylon appearing on the scene. By the way, this Babylon Empire we talk about here is technically known in history as the Neo-Babylonian Empire. There was an old Babylonian empire before the Assyrians. That's the one that probably Abraham knew. Okay, so keep that in mind. This prophecy is also dated same year as the previous one. Both had been great empires in their day. Both of them in this passage are compared to the great trees of the Garden of Eden. And both had become proud and arrogant, and therefore both were destroyed by Babylon. See, in Ezekiel, you discover that Babylon is the sword. We saw this in chapter 21 last week, if you recall. Babylonian is the sword in God's hand to destroy all the proud and arrogant nations of the world. First Assyria, then Babylon, and then Judah. Okay, all of them would meet the same fate. So Babylon plays a very important role in Ezekiel's prophecies with regards to being the instrument of God's judgment. And of course, they were not simply destroyed by Babylon. As far as Ezekiel is concerned, they were under judgment of God. There was a special warning for the Pharaoh. Remember, the Pharaohs believed that they were kings. There were two short prophecies dated a couple of weeks from each other in 585. This would be a year after the final captivity. And he was warned that he thought too much of himself, so he was playing with fire the way the king of Tyre was, that he will be destroyed by the sword of Babylon, the same sword that destroyed other kingdoms. And then we have this very unusual thing where all the kingdoms that had been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar are listed here as a reminder to Pharaoh. Don't get too haughty, don't get too arrogant. Look what happened to Assyria. Look what happened to Elam. Elam is a kingdom between Babylon and Persia. Look what happened to Meshech and Tubal. That's probably the Armenian southern Russia into northern Turkey part of the world. Look at Edom, that's south of Judah. Look at Sidon, that's Phoenicia. They were all victims of divine judgment. The lesson in Ezekiel 32 is this. When the nations disappear from history, they disappear from history because God has judged them for something. Whatever it is, nations don't just disappear from history because they lost their physical prowess, their military power. No, because they are judged by God. In other words, God is controlling history. That becomes a really important thought in Daniel's prophecies. God has complete control. He appoints kings, he removes them. Okay, chapter 32 is the last piece for today. But for those of you who may be interested, tomorrow I'm doing this presentation at the Chinese church, a short presentation on war in the Bible, followed by questions. I've gotten some really heavy-duty questions. This will be on the church Facebook. It will be live at 2 p.m. The title is Just War, two different meanings. It is just a war, or it is a just war. So we're looking at those two angles. I was asked to do this because all the questions being raised and the discussions about what's happening in Israel and Gaza, but we're taking a completely different approach, looking strictly at the Bible, how war is used in the Bible. Some of the members there started really looking up these war passages in the Bible and having a lot of questions about them. So if you have nothing to do, you can log on to the BACC Facebook. Just search BACC and you'll find their Facebook, and the session will be live. So if you're interested, so I'm inviting you for that. If you have nothing to do and you're interested in this subject, there's a good chance we may refer to Israel and Gaza a little bit here and there, but that's not the focus of the presentation. And so next week we will cover smaller chunk, chapters 33 to 39. And then the week after that, we will do the final chunk in the book, which is unbroken from 40 to 48. And so 2 more sessions, and then we'll be done with the book of Ezekiel. And again, my encouragement is, if you have time, read the coming chapters so that you have a better idea, since here we're just looking at a macro view of these chapters. All right, any question or thought or comment before we have prayer? I know we're not actually over time because we started a bit later, so just about an hour. I have a long Sabbath tomorrow. I'm sure there are others in here who have long Sabbaths as well. No questions? I know Sanki cannot ask question because he has no voice.
Right, so I think I asked you this question earlier, but seems probably for the benefit of everyone.
Go ahead.
I think as we know it, or as the Bible projects it, that heaven is a perfect place, or God's dwelling place is a perfect place. So, in that perfection, how does pride is able to exist?
Okay. I'm going to say something that may challenge your prior knowledge and prior beliefs. Sin is not possible if there is no perfection. And so the Bible makes this very clear. Sin can only begin in heaven. Let me stop the recording.